Simon Fordham, professor of history at Virginia College in Charleston, South Carolina, as well as an author and historian. You know, Chris Rock, the comedian, has often said that the only thing I know about black history is slavery and Martin Luther King. And unfortunately, that's not only true of himself, but of, I would say, a large majority of people these days. And some people, unfortunately, get it from the worst kind of phony websites, bogus documentaries, and this type of thing. And so it's important that those of us who specialize in this stuff let the public know about the real history. Not only that, there's Langston Hughes in the NAACP's Crisis magazine, June 1941. He spoke at length about the need for books on legitimate heroes of African American history. And sadly, the same thing is still true today. Most people just don't really know about the heroes that existed between the end of slavery and the rise of Martin Luther King. And every single city with a sizable black population had those types of heroes. And one of them was this guy named Sam Solomon. Now, Sam Solomon, who you see right here in this book called, this picture of him, from this book called Black Miami in the 20th Century by Marvin Dunn. And he did an amazing thing back in 1931. And he was actually an amazing person, too. You see, Sam Solomon was born in 1902. As a matter of fact, he wasn't originally from Miami, though. He was born, as a matter of fact, he was born in Albany, Georgia, which is the same hometown as the great pianist and singer Ray Charles. At the age of 15, he actually published a newspaper in Albany. But his horizons there apparently were somewhat lacking, so around 1935, he was about 33 years old. He moved to Miami, Florida. And he was a licensed mortician, so he started his own Sam Solomon Funeral Home, and he became, and it was over on 223 Northwest 10th Street, in what was then called Colored Town, which we today refer to in Miami as Overtown. Then he also became a member of the Mount Zion Baptist Missionary Baptist Church in that city. But he came to fame quite by an interesting circumstance. You see, through much of the early 20th century, African Americans were denied the right to vote. But then in 1937, the state of Florida passed a law banning what was called the poll tax, which forced black people to pay a special tax in order to vote. So they were having municipal elections in Miami in 1939. And Sam Solomon was, at this point, he was a member of the Negro Citizen Service League in that city. And he soon became a leader of that organization. So at this point, the Klan, of Ku Klux Klan in that city, figured that the African Americans would take advantage of the fact that the poll tax no longer existed. And they began threatening the African American community not to vote. They were hanging people in effigy and staging these mass rallies and threatening to murder people and such. But Sam Solomon publicly got up and said, the League, and this is a direct quote, the League intends to challenge the Klan by going to the polls in larger numbers than anticipated. So he went around rallying the African American community to get up and go out and vote on the elections on May the 2nd, 1939. The threats on Sam Solomon increased, but he actually told the Pittsburgh Courier newspaper in an interview on June the 22nd, 1940, "They won't have anything to gain by killing me, and I am not a least bit afraid to die." He was serious. So on May the 2nd, 1939, Sam Solomon did the massive act of literally leading 1,500 African Americans to go out to the polls, to go out to register to vote that day. And the New York Times covered it the very next day. And black people across the country heard about this and were greatly inspired. In fact, at the NAACP convention that year that took place in Richmond, Virginia that June, he was one of the speakers along with First Lady of the United States, Eleanor Roosevelt. And he was referred to by a nickname he kept for a very long time, the Moses of Miami. Soon he established his own newspaper called the Miami Whip, And of course the header said, published by Sam Solomon, the Moses of Miami. However, in the midst of all of this attention, he attracted the jealousy of other black leaders. And so he had to deal with that situation eventually he left town in the 1940s. But he eventually returned. The Miami Whip, however, ceased to exist after 1950. And but before that happened, in 1946, March the 1st, he met with President Harry Truman, along with the gathering of other prominent black newspapermen. Well, after the newspaper bit the dust in 1950, we see very little on the record of Sam Solomon. There was a report in November of 1964 that an assassination attempt was made on him in St. Augustine, Florida. Apparently this was after the time Martin Luther King was leading demonstrations in that city. But after that, we hear no more of Sam Solomon. In fact, on the website known as the Political Graveyard, Sam Solomon is listed as being, quote, presumed deceased, burial location unknown. He almost vanished from the pages of history. And that's why it's important to really study these things, because young people need to know that in spite of any odds they face these days, there were people like Sam Solomon who were unafraid to challenge the system and do something about it, and still went on to, by all accounts here, live a fairly long life. And as a matter of fact, Sam Solomon's legacy was best captured in a poem by Langston Hughes, the great African-American author, in a book he wrote in 1943 called Jim Crow's Last Stand. He wrote a poem called The Ballad of Sam Solomon that ended with these words. It told the story of Sam's encounter with the Ku Klux Klan and getting the people in Miami to vote, and it ended by saying, Sam Solomon said, "Go get out your Klan, but you must have forgotten, a Negro is a man." If you want to learn more about Sam Solomon, you could read Black Miami in the 20th Century by Marvin Dunn that I mentioned earlier. There was also Chanelle Rose who wrote a little bit about him in The Struggle for Black Freedom in Miami. And there's a dissertation called by Eminent Domain, Race and Capital in the Building of American South Florida by Nathaniel Connolly. But there's no complete book yet that's entirely dedicated to Sam Solomon, but hopefully this will cause his story to be told and others to be inspired. This is Damon Fordham.